Welcome to the symposium toward a border crossing model of culture, insights from Indigenous psychology. There are two versions of Indigenous psychology, one with the lowercase I and the other with the capital I. This symposium has implications for all Indigenous psychologists, and that is the lowercase I. But we focus on the capital I, which is Indigenous populations, more specifically the hunter-gatherers, for purposes of illustration. The pandemic drives home more than ever the permeable nature of all groups in the global village. How do we update our psychological models to reflect the reality of culture's permeability? Some of the stereotypical notions of Indigenous psychology need to go. To the extent that Indigenous psychology stresses the difference and particularity of groups, it has a tendency to present culture as static and frozen in time. Quite on the contrary, no culture stands still, and no culture is an island. What happens when cultures come into contact? We know the familiar story. Some cultures go into extinct. This symposium presents another side of the story. First, Indigenous cultures can be resilient. Some hunter-gatherer groups retain their cultural integrity even when they take on the cognitive styles of the dominant culture through the colonization process. The second point is that dominant cultures have much to learn from Indigenous populations if we are going to have a more just and equitable psychology for the 21st century. The first point will be addressed by Dr. Rachel Cynthia Ting from Monash University in Malaysia. The second point will be addressed by Dr. Richard Katz. As a discussant, I think the importance of this panel lies in calling our attention to the fact that the key to human flourishing lies in cultural diversity. Without cultural diversity, human civilization in the age of the machine will be a triumphant march toward unification, exemplified by the barcode. The artist Banksy says it well. I leave you with this thought, and without further ado, the first speaker is Dr. Rachel Ting from Monash University in Malaysia.
Hey, thank you, Louise, for the wonderful introductions. And I hope we can get to learn while we dialogue on this topic. So today I'm going to present on my research findings and together with some discussions about the implication of my research. Okay, I'm trying to share the whole screen here. The title is called Religious Diversity Among the Indigenous People of Malaysia. Just like Louise said, there are two kinds of Indigenous psychology. One is with a small I, one is with a capitalized I. So first I will try to take a more emic approach to this capitalized I, the Indigenous people group, the particular group we call TEMIARS in Malaysia. And then later on, we will try to map the findings to a small I, the more from a global perspective. We want to see how the Indigenous psychology we learn from this TEMIAR group could benefit the global psychologist. So this is the abstract. We are zooming into a micro level first about their cognitive styles and wanting to know how the worldview is shaped by their cognitive styles. And we know that many hunter-gatherers all over the world, they are still living in what we say a very tribal ecology, whereas a lot of them still practice what we say so-called animistic or spiritual-oriented type of religions. And in contrast to the monotheistic world religions such as Christianity and Muslim. So in Malaysia, we had such a nice and diverse landscape to study how all these world religions and these indigenous religions affect the TEMIAR lifestyles and what happened when they come into contact with each other. So we try to ask open questions. What will happen when these TEMIAR groups try to interpret their sufferings from their own religious landscape and worldview? So over 3 years, we have done a psychoanthropological study fieldworks by talking to people in individual settings, such as interview, and also through focus group gathering with the spiritual and religious leaders. So we really listen to the narrative of their sufferings. And in these studies, we will also pick 43 interview scripts to analyze and code them thematically, and then try to review what are the major themes of the causes of their sufferings and what are the help-seeking behaviors they adopt. And the gist of it is that many of them contributed to social, political discrimination and injustice. So this is actually continuations of our previous study that is documented by a published monograph called Suffering of E-People, and which is another similar study we pioneered in China over 3 years. After this study, I took a similar research protocol, returned to Malaysia, and do a similar study among the so-called the indigenous people in Malaysia. And there are different types of suffering events and suffering history, but the research methodology are pretty similar. And we use similar framework trying to understand and map their narrative to cognitive styles that proposed by SUNDARARAJAN on the cultural rationalities. I will further explain that towards the end of this mapping. So first, I just want to let you know that even though I'm a Malaysian, I'm not a part of the indigenous people, but this is also an eye-opening experience when I first delved into this remote area. And I realized there's another side of Malaysia that I didn't know. And then, although these are very minority groups, a very small percentage of people, but they have been living in this Borneo, in these islands, on these Malay peninsulas for thousands of years. And genetic researchers have found that can be dated back to 5,000 of years. Their genes are similar to those African ancestors. And after so many thousand years of evolvement and development and colonizations of Malaysia, and these people still exist in the remote area and in the, what we say, the foresty areas. And there are major 3 tribal groups that we usually, the anthropologists divide them into. But under these 3 major groups, there are totally 18 subgroups. So we are studying one bigger subgroup called TEMIAR, which is relatively still solidified in their identity. They are still taking pride in their identity, whereas some of them are more assimilated to the overall Malaysian cultures and adopt different lifestyles. Whereas TEMIAR group, the one we chose, are still very much living in poverty due to land right issues. In Malaysia, we don't have the land gazetted, owned by the indigenous people themselves. So they face displacement and the positions when there is so-called development coming into the jungles. The jungle is their home, and then when there is a lot of so-called logging company coming in, their home is taken away. And although there is reservations, so-called reservations for them, however, what we heard recently is that there's a lot of impeachments of the borders. So there's no clear borders, and then the map, there is not well defined of the lands that supposed to reserve to them. And poverty is still quite prevalent among them. And the malnutrition for the younger generations are there because due to food shortage. Education has been a big struggle. How do you make what we say the orang asli, the indigenous people's children to continue their education in the where there is a brick of walls for them, and many of them have escaped boarding school because they miss their families. So, and there were so many tragedies about children in the boarding school die because of getting lost in the jungles or getting abused. So it's still happening nowadays. On and off, we heard tragedies like this. Even in the pandemic, when the school turned online, many indigenous kids, they drop out of school because they don't have tablet, no internet access. So mainly there is no conditions for them to continue the schools during pandemic. So there is a very severe erosions of their traditional ways of living where they used to just go for hunting, and now there's a banning of hunting of certain animals. So there is what they say the Pahilitan regulations of hunting. They used to take what animals they think are food, the resources of food like monkeys. Then nowadays they are banned from overkilling. They also cannot kill elephants, of which seems to be a hazard to them because elephants come and fight food with them. So there's a conflict between them and the animal world that it seems like doesn't favor them in the under the protections of animal worlds, animal kingdoms. So there is a lot of dilemmas and plight happening. So we chose TEMIAR because they still kept certain part of their traditions called Sewang. Sewang is a local Malay word that describe the rituals they observe. So a lot of them, they call Sewang as part of their ADAT, their budaya, their culture. They don't call it religion. They say we have our own culture. It's called ADAT. So when they say ADAT, it means like people come and gather in an open area in a hut. Every village, they build a hut like this, is shown in the pictures, where it's open communal space for the villagers to come to hold their wedding, funeral, or any other big communal events during or for healing rituals or for any kind of big decisions. Even when politician comes, this is the spaces that is revered. And they also built a very specific closed worship house. And because it's closed, they don't open it to the outsiders to record. So it's a very special protected space. So even among TEMIARs, there are people who still do healing rituals in almost every day or every other days among themselves. They don't really need a special, what we say, the witch doctor to orchestrate the rituals. They have the informal Sewang, informal ritual, and also formal ritual where it's a bit like church service where there is expected routine to do. And the formal service that we observe or we immerse ourselves as a participants, it's all dark. We cannot record. They don't allow any kind of technology into this house of worship because they still think that technology is like a defamation to the natural spirits. When during the rituals, they welcome the spirits to come and dwell among them. So they believe there is spirits in every living things, even plants. So they use flowers and bouquet as part of the symbols of spiritual dwelling and embodiments. So for all the guys, they know how to weave a kind of hat since birth. It's just simple. Only TEMIAR group wear this. And when they go out for public events, they all wear this. They call it temple. It's a part of we and the natural as in one. We got these ingredients from the natural spirits, and it's only worn by guy. For the girls, for females, they don't wear this temple, but they put flowers, wild flowers at the back of their hair. I think I have some pictures. And the wildflowers all come from their own plantations around the environment. So one thing that really amazed me is how much wildflowers they have. The wildflowers we never see, the kind of species we never see in the urban areas, where they still kept it. And they don't really grow like flower gardens, but the flower is everywhere, the wildflowers. And one time I almost made a mistake by breaking their taboos of plucking their flowers, because I thought everyone put flower in their hair. I want to do that. But they told me I am not supposed to pluck flowers after 5 p.m., 5 o'clock, because that's when the spirit come back and rest and dwell in the flowers. So they only pluck flowers in the daytime when the spirit is out. So there is a part of respect and awe to the nature, and among themselves, there's a common sense of what to do with the nature. Even going into the hunting areas, they go and pray first to the natural ghost or spirits, the deity, to pray for peace with the wild boar and animals before they go in, so they won't get harmed by the forest, and also pray for forgiveness if they hunt any food from the jungles. So it's a kind of reciprocal relationship with the spiritual environment realm in the jungles. So this is the kind of culture that we are stepping into, and that's the locations mainly telling us what happened to this area. It became a reserve land after they built a dam inside. So before that, there was no dam, and after the ecology changed, then all the villages are built around the dam because they got displaced. So the villages are actually quite new, only built by the British colonial in this century. Before that, there was no dam. So because of them, they started, some of those people, villages live closer to the dam, they start doing fishing. Those people who live outside, more inland in the forest, in the mountain, they start doing some kind of plantations, but it's not a land of agriculture. We don't see any kind of economic agriculture, but they give rubber seeds. The government gives rubber seeds to these people to start doing some kind of tradings. So they trade fish and they trade rubbers as living sources. Other times they just do their own occasional hunting that's allowed within the perimeters as the food resources. So it's really hard to assess these parts. So imagine it took us 5 hours to get in with the 4-wheel drive, but how do they get out without 4-wheel drive? So there's no way for them to easily assess the outside world. Only outsiders go in, and usually the logging company, logging trucks go in, and they build logging roads, and that's how we go in. The road conditions are not well maintained, and usually they come up by boat through the dam area, and the boat itself is very expensive because the fuel, the gas, all are very expensive supply during that. So many of them chose to stay in the village since birth until that death. They didn't really have contact with the outside world. So that's the landscape. And how does the Islam and Christianity come into this place? Also because of a lot of evangelism activities. As Malaysia is an Islamic country, so there is by natural courses a lot of Islamization going on with the indigenous people, trying to convert them earlier on by giving them a lot of benefits. If you convert since birth, you got a Muslim name, Islamic name, and on your ID card, and then you are entitled to a lot of benefits as a Bumiputra, as a local citizen. So they give local citizenship in exchange of religious identity. That's how many of them get converted. And there are also some Christian missionary activities going on during that area. So 10% of them become Christian converts. As you can see that they built little worship house, Christian houses also in their communities. So we found this diversity, and we started to ask questions, what happened between these three communities? Are they still keeping the similar cognitive styles, similar rationality, similar type of worldviews, or they completely change? So these are the pictures we took online because we are not allowed to record them. So this is from public domain pictures during their sewa and their rituals. So our interviewees' demographic are shown here. We try to be an insider through cultural immersions. We have done many trips. And we first conduct focus group discussions with the religious leader. And what was interesting, there is many female, usually the men are the, what we say, the dog batting, the head, village head. But somehow, because we researchers are female, we attract more female interviewees and also the focus group leaders in this way. They feel safer talking to female researchers. And there is still very strong distinctions, hierarchy between male and females. So even in the rituals, female are not allowed to pray. Female are only there to echo. But the male are the one who chants, who lead the chanting. Female are there to collect the bouquet, make the flowers, do the cleanings. And male are the leaders in huntings. So very strong gender differentiations in this village and culture. And that's me and my research lab students. As we say, we are all female. So what we found that the major suffering events, as I said, are still, a lot of them still suffer with poverty. They reported poverty is a major sources. The second one is the social discrimination because they feel they are the indigenous people, but they are not being recognized with as a citizen. Only if they choose to convert, then it's a conditional citizenship. And they have to be assimilated and act like a Malay in order to be accepted by the society. If they don't learn the Malay language or they don't dress like Malay, probably, people will look down on them. They are being seen as backward. So they perceive a lot of discrimination from the Malay groups. So there's also a lot of complaints about lack of basic public facilities. And because it was promised to them, that's their major disgruntled is the government promised all this, they will build school, we will build basic roads, facilities, but then they did not fulfill their promise after they took away our lands. So that's a lot of frustrations among the people. And there are other deaths and illnesses. What we found that among Christians, as you can see, there are some themes more obvious to some groups than other groups. There is more awareness about personal incapacity among the Muslim group under theme 8, and there's a lot more awareness about cultural misfit among Muslim group. And the Christian group reported more faith-related struggles, such as their personal faith with God being challenged. They also don't feel that they can keep their faith in this environment. And also more family and marital struggle issues for Christian and Muslim groups, whereas the traditional group, they did not report that. So what are the causes of their sufferings? When we ask them, why do you think it happened to you? And a lot of them attribute it to, we don't have our lands, our natural environment got exploited. Because of water pollutions, we are sick because the land got taken away. That's why we fall into poverty. That's why we have malnutrition. We don't have enough food. So that's their explanations. As you can see, one thing here is that the traditional groups talk about deforestation as a threat, and whereas Christian group and Muslim group, they don't talk about it as the reasons of their sufferings. So for traditional groups, the attributions that our forests are being taken away as a major source of sufferings. And these are the quotes that I couldn't go through one by one, but you can see under the big category, there is subcategories, whereas we will have a poster sessions that me and my students, we will present this more in depth through our poster sessions. You are welcome to attend to that one. So lastly, we asked what kind of help that you have sought during these difficult times, who have been there to help you. So actually what we found that majority of the ADAT, the traditional groups, they still talked about, refer to government agency. This is something that surprises. And why? Because even though governments are not helpful, but they think this is government responsibility because of exchange of lands and the unfulfilled promise. So there are more activism going on with the traditional groups, whereas we don't hear that kind of activist narrative among Christian and Muslim groups. So we see that Christian group talk about religious network as their helpful resources. They go to pastor to help, and they go to outside churches. There's a larger, let's say, Baptist church, Alliance church outside, or Lutheran church, big umbrella, as someone who can come and supply them with food and materials. They were more reliance on outside religious network. People they have never seen, but they heard of. And same thing, Muslim has more reliant on themselves, their family, and also talk about NGO partnership, people that, where we say non-governmental agencies. And whereas we also found that there are more spiritual resources being utilized by the TEMIAR traditional groups. And since it's not a statistical comparison, so we can only look at the percentage breakdown to give us a bigger rough sense of what is their preference in terms of help seeking. And so in order to compare theoretically, we try to utilize this ecological rationality model or ecological rationality models that we use with the E people in our study with China, whereas we found that Christian group and world religions, usually they come from a weak ties membership natures, whereas traditionally many hunter-gatherers still adhere to strong ties network. And this kind of ecology, we say strong ties network were born, will give birth to strong ties or evolve with strong ties rationality. So the core evolvement of ecology and rationalities are the backdrop of our theory. So we try to map them based on their attributions of suffering events and also their help-seeking network. So this is what comes out when we try to map the sub-themes by two different axes. One axis is how do they manipulate, how they interact with their environment. Is it more external or internal? Another axis is on the who do they go to in terms of the network help seeking, or who do they go for, or the space, the external space they go for, or the internal space they go for in terms of information processing and in terms of coping strategies. So these two axes will give us a sense that how much their rationality are still falling into the what we say the strong tie space or the weak tie space. We assume that the weak ties will privilege more public share space and also public network membership by membership, and also they will privilege more internal attribution, internal manipulations, trying to regulate their own emotions or trying to regulate individual mental resources. So as we can see the right upper corner where we say it's the weak ties rationality, actually it's only mapped by the Christian group. The brown color are the themes reported by Christian groups. And whereas the majority are still on the left bottom corners. Left bottom corner are the kind of rationality that talk about we do things rather than who we are. It's more a doing mode. We work on the crops as our help seeking, and then we rely on the people we know, what we say the strong ties network. So these are what we say the strong ties rationality in contrast to weak ties rationalities. In terms of the help attribution themes, after we map, we also found that Christian groups, the brown colors, are actually falling on the right side, on the right upper side. So Christian will attribute this as their personal weakness, sinful natures, and also some Muslim group also talk about the differences in religious belief system. So those differences of religious differences are reported mainly by those converted Christian and converted Muslims, because after they got converted, they realized they are very different from their other traditional villagers, and they feel being excluded sometimes in the rituals. For example, the traditional Sewangs will talk about feast. They will eat, dine together, but there are many kind of feast that is halal, non-halal for Muslim. Muslim cannot eat wild boar, where wild boar is the major source of feast, animal or monkeys. Anything with 4 legs cannot be eaten by Muslims. So Muslims themselves, they had to exclude themselves from all these feasting activities. So it's a kind of, they feel very different. And sometimes Muslim group, they also have their own fasting month, whereas the traditional group, they don't have. So all this will naturally differentiate them. And also Muslim, they ban alcohol. So whereas the traditional people, they still drink alcohol once in a while, the kind of wine they make from their crops. So all these diet differences also differentiate them. And it doesn't cause conflicts. What we found that actually there's no conflicts. They were still very respectful towards each other, dietary differences, but somehow they don't mingle together that much. And Christians also, they don't mingle with all this Sewang traditional, because for them, this is something you are worshiping the kind of ghost that we don't identify with. This is different than Christian God. So because they still come together for ceremonial activities, but they don't participate in the healing, chanting, and all the traditional rituals anymore for Christians. And Christians have more awareness about marital conflicts. Same thing, they found that divorce is not okay, polygamy is not okay. Whereas traditional, they don't have that kind of moral judgment or distinctions about what you could do with your marriage. So, and in that way, some of them, in order to try to be faithful to their religions, they cannot still stay so close to so-called the traditional spiritual practice. So in this way, we found that although majority of them, all 3 groups still go for the strong ties network in their help seeking, but somehow Christian group are the one that have the weak ties mentalities on the right. So this is something that we have been reflecting on. These are researcher memos written by my students, my research assistants, when they go into the immersions. After the immersions, this research, they found that there's a sense of frustration and anger because of social injustice, that these people are not being entitled to certain welfare in the country. Whereas even we Chinese, we are the second races in this country. We see them ourselves as minority group, but we are entitled to a lot of more welfare than these indigenous people. So that's a sense of guilt that spurred also from among the researchers. Another thing that shocks my RA is that they don't go for toilet. There's no toilet in the village, no built toilets. So everywhere is toilets for them. But it creates a certain type of inconvenience for the women's group. And women's group complain that because of water pollutions, by the illegal logging and illegal mining, they cannot take water from the river or from the dam without cautions. So now they are facing that issues with the environment. So what happened to them after COVID is something also I've been puzzling, because we are not allowed to visit them. There's a very sharp contrast towards the outsiders. Once they found out there is a virus going on in the city, many fled back to their village. Even those people who are laborers in the city and in the factories, many quit their job and go back to their rural for refuge. And they hide in the jungles for self-sufficiency. Many of them, because there's no more trading activities going on during lockdowns. So in order to survive, they had to rely on the original sources again in the jungles. But then it's really hard for them to observe physical distance in their ecology. Kids still mingle around. So I visited them once last year after the pandemic by giving them masks, but apparently there's no social distancing, no physical distancing, or no mask wearing. And part of it is mask is expensive. But that also at the same time, many of them are not open to vaccination because it's something foreign, abstract rationality, and many of them still has certain misconception, or they read news or rumors that people die they are facing with the make. If many of them still are refusing vaccinations, and still many of them are relying on limited food supply and relief from government and NGOs. So the conclusion is that the current plight is still going on because our history, human history, is still evolving with pandemic and more reliance on technology nowadays. But these tribal people, due to the mismatch of ecology or rationality, they will continue to live in this plight until one side change their rationality in the approach, in the developmental approach. So we are promoting or advocating for a better match or a more culturally appropriate approach to help them to develop their lands in a more sustainable way, at the same time listening to their stories to get a sense of where they come from, rather than labeling or stereotyping them as someone who is backward, lazy, dependent. Because it's all due to their strong ties mentalities that they got misunderstood by the modern people, or what we so-called the civilized society. And we also found that religious conversion do make a differences in converting their mental space as well, as also contributed to some internal conflicts in terms of their cultural identity, newly adopted identities. Towards the end, we also want to thank them because they have been telling us what does collective destiny means. A lot of the time they use a lot of words like we, or actually we, the TEMIAR people, we TEMIAR. They don't say I, they always use the word we. That's our collective destiny. Either we improve together, or we are suffering together. So these are our funding resources and people I want to acknowledge for helping me to gather the data. And these are the local people, the picture taken by our frontlines, cultural informants during this pandemic time. And apparently the kids are still very happy in front of camera. So thank you for listening and tuning in. I hope we get a chance to interact during the office hours. Okay, I would like to pass the time and mic to Dr. Richards.
Thank you very much, Rachel and Louise. Louise, they're one of my favorite people on this planet. So I very much enjoy being part of this group here, and see if I can add a few ideas, a few experiences to maybe round out some of the things that Rachel has been pointing out and talking about with such feelings of connection. Very nice to hear that, hey, Rachel?
Thank you.
Yeah, in 1968, I don't know if people remember when that happened. That was a while ago. I went to the Kalahari Desert to live and work with the Juntua people, who are existing primarily as hunter-gatherers. I think nowadays it's primarily as hunter-gatherers. There's nobody who's just purely hunter-gathering. And these are people who, for us, represent 99% of the history of the human species. So there's a lot of fundamental knowledge with evolutionary meaning, if we begin to listen more carefully to what indigenous people have to say. I see them very much as our first psychologists. They were the people who gathered together and struggled with problems that psychology tries to deal with: human concerns, human connection, sickness, illness, conflict, aspirations. This is what they were dealing with. So they're our first psychologists. The Juntois were sharing their land. If one group had a particular area where the berries were ripe, and another group had a particular area where the game was running, they shared, they exchanged, so that nobody would go hungry if somebody was being fed. If everybody was hungry, that would happen. But if one group was being fed and the other was hungry, that wouldn't happen. There would be that sharing of resources. The central event, the central ritual is the healing dance, and that's what I'd like to talk about. In that healing dance, the entire village comes, and they don't come to heal sick people. They come primarily to be with each other. So one of the first things we understand is that healing is not focused on curing illness, it's focused on bringing people together and creating a healing environment. And in that healing environment, the Juntois focus on what I would call a spiritual energy. Now, I want to talk about this, and I want to emphasize that I don't think we have to have any biophysical and biological and neurological research to prove that spiritual energy exists. I know people do that, and that's okay. But for me personally, I don't need that confirmation. And from an indigenous point of view, that confirmation is not even icing on the cake, because people already know it exists, the spiritual energy called Ngum. And I wanted to maybe read a little bit what they're talking about when they talk about the Ngum and the healing dance. Here's one of the healers. He says, "You dance, 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 and then the Ngum lifts you in your belly and lifts you in your back. And the Ngum makes you tremble. It's hot. But when you get into the state of Pia, you're looking around because you see everybody. You see everything. You see what's troubling everybody." So that lived experience of Ngum doesn't have to be proved, because from an indigenous point of view of the Juntois, we know it because we experience it. I know there'll be lots of people in psychology that say, well, that's what we used to do before we became a science. But if we take seriously indigenous teachings, we have to realize that not only was it what was before Western science, Western psychology came to being, but it's what people still realize is the pinnacle of and the driving force of their lives. So this Ngum exists because the culture is such that sees around it life everywhere, spiritual everywhere. When you hunt, and Rachel talked about this, you don't hunt animals, you hunt the spirit of the animal. And the animal looks to the hunter who observes proper respect and shows themselves. I was up in Alaska, and you know they have hunting of whales there, right? And they have a blanket toss. And they lift, you know, the person gets tossed up in the blanket. And the Western perspective is they toss the hunter up in the blanket so the hunter can look wide, you know, far out into the ocean to see where the whales are. No. From the point of view of indigenous people in Alaska, you do the blanket toss and you toss somebody up so the whale can see who it is that's hunting. And if it's the right person with respect, they come in and give themselves. So there are things that happened in the Kalahari that many people could say, well, we have to see if it's real. The num is hot. Let me see if I can read another little thing to give you an idea of how this thing operates. In your backbone, says Kainacho, in your backbone, you feel pointed something. It works its way up. The base of your spine is tingling, tingling, tingling. And then num makes your thoughts nothing in your head. Now, we don't have to go any further than that. That is reality. Now, is it our reality? That's what I'd like to talk about as this talk unfolds a bit. So, two stories. This num is held. People hold it, but they cannot contain it. Okay? They hold it because it's concrete, but it's not containable because it's spiritual energy. And one of the things that we learn is that when healers in a Western context try to own their healing power, it destroys, from a Juntois point of view, it destroys that very power. And I will talk about that a little bit later. So I get back from the Kalahari in 1968, give a lecture at Harvard University. That's where I was doing my studies. First question after I talked about the healing dance and the num, the first question, did you bring a thermometer? I said, what? You don't know, to measure, was there actual heat? So there is in a nutshell, the dilemma. And I'd like to kind of continue along that and try to talk about the reality of what people feel is unreal unless it's proven by certain Western positivistic research methods. And that's what I feel the contribution of indigenous approaches to psychology can give mainstream psychology an appreciation for a much wider, a much broader, a much deeper understanding of reality through personal experience. So after 1968, going there, I had a career at Harvard, had the pleasure of having people who I still think fondly of, Erickson and Henry Murray. Henry Murray was really one of my special mentors. And also, of course, B.F. Skinner was walking around, the same thing. So you had already there that contrast. And you know what Skinner said? We all know that. He said things like hope and things like belief, they exist only because they're placeholders for the time until we can do research that prove they exist. That was his point of view. They're placeholders. So their Harvard was the exact conflict. I went back to the Kalahari. That was really the turning point in my own life of trying to devote myself to doing research on indigenous health and healing. I went back there and was a little bit smarter the second time. The first time I went there, hey, I'm going to learn how to heal. Hey, looking at Rachel right now, because she probably had the same thing. Louise, I'm going to learn how to heal. That was so naive. Second time I went there, I learned that my job was to help the healers. You see? And from the point of view of the community, that's as important as the healer. So, and then I went off to other places in Rosebud Reservation and 3 years living in Fiji. And I've been living in Canada, in Saskatchewan for the past 35 years, working with Cree and Saulteaux people. And so this has been my life since that 1968 event. And I've written some books and on the idea of being told in 1968, tell our story to your people. Naively, I took it literally. And what I want to talk about at the end of my presentation is how I've now come to understand that it's much more complicated than simply tell our story to your people. First of all, who are my people? Secondly, what is the story? And third, why me? You see, so we'll talk a little more about that. But today, I wanted to focus on the fact that we are well beyond the idea of psychology as a Western institution, which needs to expand the tent. No more of that. We are now at the point where we have to realize that Western mainstream psychology is a colonial enterprise, a colonizing enterprise, which does things in a way that is extremely subtle, such as telling people who they are and who they should be. The whole DSM, the whole psychological testing, the whole mental health system, which is exported from the West, is basically telling people, if you're this way, you're good. If you're not this way, you're not good. This is colonization of the most basic and the most piercing kind, because from that comes the colonization of resources, economic, social, and political. When the self is robbed and stolen, it's easy to take the land. So we have to kind of say that. And the notion of white privilege, the notion of psychology as a privileged discourse, we have to say that. And like today, you probably have heard in Canada, we have this terrible thing where they're discovering the unmarked graves of children, many, many, many children who died in the residential schools. The unmarked graves. What does that mean, to not even acknowledge? That's the kind of history of colonization spoke loud. And beyond that, we have to realize that we have to do something. And doing something really involves giving up something. We have to be able to give up the power that we exert. It's, you know, a psychologist has a lot of power. Hey, Louise, a lot of power, you know, and especially in the one-to-one counseling therapy interactions. So it's a very difficult task, but we have to make space, and making space means giving up power. And the decolonization of psychology is the, how do I say, this is my passion, my mission, and this is the next step. To be explicit about it. So now we talk about cultures and indigenous psychology, indigenous cultures. And as Louise pointed out so clearly, it's all in flux. The Kalahari, where when I was there were dozens of healers. 50% of the men were healers. Today, Louise, I'm talking to Louise and Rachel, one healer left. One healer. And they have tried to move that healer away from the village because too many people were coming, and setting him up so that he can teach people properly. And, you know, they've been through a lot there. The government is intervened. Hungry people, and often they're hungry, are easy to coerce. And when we were there, I went back in 1989, we became paper people, writing letters of appeal to the government for help in various ways. And residential schools were there. I remember having a conversation with one of the government people in Botswana. I said, we have a lot of experience with residential schools here in Canada. They don't work. Oh yeah, but we have to get them away from their parents because that's what's holding them back. So that kind of change. But I have to read you this thing that that one of my best friends said about what's happening to the healing dance with all this thing. He says this: Num, the spiritual energy, is just the same as long ago, even though it keeps on changing. It's like this: if you have Num, you know things just by sitting and waiting. You see how things are. Things like whether people like each other or not. You hear things from the gods to take care of each other. Num is just the same as long ago, even though it keeps on changing. So here's a culture that's been devastated in so many ways, and yet Num is here, even though it keeps on changing. And here in Canada, and I think throughout the psychological world, we have the Canadian Psychological Association response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which tries to right some of the devastating intrusions on Indigenous people here in Canada. And if you read that Canadian Psychological Association report, it's amazing. It says things like spirituality has to always be forefront, background, constant theme. This is Psychological Association, spirituality. And then it says something, this to me was most interesting. When you're giving IQ tests to Indigenous kids, it's okay to have family there to give them support. You know how psychological tests, this is the key, mainstream psych, we don't give that up easily. It's got to be objective. No help, you have to have a poker face. They're now saying, invite the family in, make it comfortable, encourage the kids as much as possible. It's a brilliant idea. And also it says we must give up the notion of efficiency and talk about sensitivity. Not running in and saying, I've got to, give me my 6 appointments to see people. You go in, as Rachel talks about, and you live there for a bit. You see. So things are changing in that way. And there are apologies. You've heard some of these apologies, haven't you? Here's one from the Torres Island, Aboriginal people and in the Torres Islands, Australia, talking about all the ways in which psychology has dismembered people. And these are their recommendations. We have to listen more and talk less. We have to follow more and steer less. Advocate more, comply less. Include more, ignore less. Collaborate more, and command less. So psychology is changing too. Okay? So here we are then. Let's talk about something practical. I want to give one example of some of the work I've been doing, which is trying to bring some of these Indigenous principles, Indigenous teachings into teaching psychology. And I've done it at the undergraduate level with introductory psych, and most recently with clinical psychology doctoral students. How do we teach psychology so that some of those principles that NUM represents can be brought into the mainstream? And there are 2 things that can happen. One is the mainstream can be enhanced. And the second is there can be a deeper appreciation for the unique contribution of Indigenous psychology with a capital I, Louise, with a capital I. Those 2 things. And so let me talk about some of the topics. And first I want to say that before we even talk about this, we have to acknowledge the extreme cost of learning. We cannot just take any understanding of Indigenous knowledge. Has to be preceded by a gift, an exchange. And what's that gift? The gift is, the exchange is, we can never use that knowledge for anything other than serving others. We can never benefit from it personally, financially, esteem, and so forth like that. And we have to give back concretely in terms of land, in terms of resources to the people who for generations have nurtured these teachings through suffering, right? Rachel, through suffering, through being beaten, through being punished, through letting the young kids die. So here are some of the things that I talk about in this course. For example, spirituality as the foundation of everyday life. And it's not this great, Maslow got caught up in this great thing, it's the everyday spirituality. The plants are alive. The animals talk to you. The wind speaks. So spirituality then becomes something, yet this is the key point. We must remember and we must respect what remains a mystery in our lives. It cannot be fully explained. Second, research is a way of knowing. The most important data from an Indigenous point of view is personal experience. You can hear psychologists saying, well, wait a minute, we started out that way, and then we made it real by objectifying and testing. But personal experience is the ultimate reality. You don't question it. You don't interpret it. And that's more than narrative therapy. Third, healing is an exchange. It's a balance. There is no end to the healing process. The therapist is not the healer. The therapist is the vehicle for the NUM, the spiritual energy. This is a powerful teaching for clinical psychologists. They have to be skilled, but they have to realize that the healing does not come from a personal agency. It's a vehicle for. Fourth, the circle of life. It's a circle. It's not a steep incline or decline. Old people don't have to worry, eh? Because it's a circle. Every part of the circle is equally valued. Every part of the circle is equally valued. And we're all connected. Prayers, Lakota prayers, all our relations. Mainstream psychology has to see the individual fighting against the group. From an indigenous point of view, we're all not, I love, not peaceful. Arguments are there, but we are all connected. If these topics can influence mainstream psychology and values, balance, exchange, respect, spiritual, mainstream psychology can change. And also, more important, this approach itself is a model of best practices. And I can give countless examples of how I work with elders, in which I work from a psychological point of view, and we may go to a sweat, and the elders work from their point of view. Collaboration is most important, not integration. I'd never bring elders into the mainstream institution. Their work is outside. We build bridges, collaborative bridges. There are lots of challenges to that. People say, how can you grade this? Well, you don't grade it, except to say that we only look at where people start and where they end. So you don't have a standard, everybody has to get to a certain place. Where did they start and where did they end? And the real challenge, though, is giving up the privilege. I mean, you talked about this, eh, Rachel? Here we are on internet. Even here in Saskatchewan, with the COVID, people are not being vaccinated because they have no access to internet through which our appointments are being made. And for people to get access means we have to give up the extra access that we have. Look, we've just turned this thing. We're all over the world here. We're so rich. So that's the part that's really very important. Now, I just wanted to end by saying, all these years, it's more than 50 years now, I'm now beginning to see certain things more clearly. One of which is I'm beginning to know more what I don't know. I'm beginning to know the limits of my knowledge. Many, many years ago, when I first moved up here, two of the elders who I became very friendly with, he adopted me as his younger brother. He said to me, Tony Sand, he said, Dick, he said, you're just like an Indian. We love you that way. And of course, I got all puffed up, and then Emma, his wife, said, that's not quite right. We love you and like you because of who you are, a good person. That's a big difference. Now, you might say, well, Dick, obviously you're not Indigenous, but having spent so many years and so much time, you begin to kind of forget that, because the big difference, spiritual things you might understand. The life of poverty, racism, suffering, you don't understand unless you've lived it. And I say that humbly because I believe it strongly. So this is the kind of thing that I think is very important. And yet no false humility. I'm trying not to say, I don't know anything, I don't know anything. I'm just a little old. I do know certain things, but I'm seeing now more clearly its limitations. There's a concept called allyship, an ally. Very complicated concept. How do we prevent being an ally, meaning come aboard our white ship, our mainstream psychology ship, and be one of us? I'll never forget, way long ago when I was working in Roxbury in Boston, I was working with 3 women who were active community leaders, powerful women. Mass Mental Health Center, where I worked, looked out and saw these powerful women. And what did they do? Hey, would you guys like a job? That's the end of their power as they joined the institution. So allyship is a very tough one. Can I end with 2 stories? I'm not even sure how much time I have. I've just been talking, but I'll tell you 2 stories, okay? So we went to the Kalahari, and one of the healers was Komajo. And one of my colleagues looked at me and said, you're coming into the Kalahari, eh? Would you be prepared to have Komajo drop in on your life? Where would you put him? Hey, Rachel, you know, we go there. Are we prepared to have them come and visit us? And then we see the power differential, the privilege differential. And I'm trying very hard to acknowledge that and to see how that gap can be made less. And then finally, Joe Eaglove, who was another one of my spiritual fathers, you know, he was doing a sweat, and he used to have people come from different parts of the world. There was a guy there from Germany. And in his sweat, the 3rd round was always prayers. You go around the sweat lodge and you give prayers. And this guy from Germany comes before the sweat, says to Joe, I don't think I'll be able to participate in that 3rd round because I don't speak Lakota. And my English is not good. I can only speak German. And Joe turned to him and said, the Creator knows all languages. So with that, I have, like I say, I have no idea how much time is left or if I've gone over, but that's really where I'd like to end. So thank you for listening, and I hope that anybody who turns in and listens to our symposium gets something from it. And we'd love to hear from you, right? Thanks.
Well, I think that this symposium is very, very rich. I think there's a lot to digest, and I think we certainly have plenty of things to digest and to ask questions about. And I think we would love to answer all questions about Indigenous psychology in general, or the materials about Indigenous population, the capital I, in particular, that's presented here today, that we'll be happy to answer all the questions. We hope we can meet all of you in the business hour.
Yeah, that would be good.
Yeah, that would be very good.
I'd be very happy to do that. Yeah.
So, yeah, I will end my recording here. And
can I just say one more thing?
Okay,
Louise,
sure.
This woman here, Louise, I think people know, but I have to say it because I think sometimes we don't say things that we know. A special person, and I love this person, but part of the specialness is, Louise, your ability to your broad vision, your broad vision, which includes different ways of knowing, and respecting each of them. That's very unusual. You respect Rachel's way of knowing, you respect my way of knowing, and you have your own way of knowing. This is a very strong and powerful gift that we need. Because the thing is, hey, Rachel, my job is not to criticize psychology. It's to offer alternative views.
Mm-hmm.
Criticizing doesn't get anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So thank you, Louise, for all that you've done.
Thank you, Dick, and thank you, Rachel. And I think we, as I said, we have a lot of things that is very thought-provoking. We have offered a lot of thought-provoking and a new model for psychology, for doing psychology. If we reflect on the materials presented here, we have a model emerging, a new wonderful model for doing psychology. Thank you, Dick, and thank you, Rachel.
Thank you very much.
Louise, for the opportunity.
Yeah.